Chosen today for my message, the title of my message is Two Nearly Identical Twins. Two nearly identical twins. So we're going to watch a clip real quick. Let me set the clip up for you. The clip is taken from a movie called Parent Trap. How many of you have seen Parent Trap? Let me raise your hands. Okay. How many of you saw the 1998 Lindsay Lohan version of Parent Trap? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you saw the 1961 version with Hayley Mills? Raise your hand. Oh, wow, really? I'm surprised. Okay, that's cool. Wow, this is the Lindsay Lohan version. So let me set the clip up for you. So these are two twin girls separated at birth. Their parents got divorced. One girl went to London with her mother. Her mother becomes a dressmaker. One girl goes with her father to California. He has a vineyard, raises grapes for wine there. And then, oddly enough, they come together. The two twin sisters come together at the same camp, a summer camp. And they obviously recognize they're looking into the mirror. Right? So they look exactly alike. So the conversation starts, and they discover that they're actually sisters. And then they kind of hatch a plan. So let's watch the clip as they hatch the plan. Well, that's my favorite clip of the whole film. And you're crying. It always makes us both cry when we see there's a clip of the film. So anyhow. So if you were to look at these two girls on the natural, just a casual glance of who these girls are, you would say they're identical, wouldn't you? They look identical. The fact is they weren't identical at all. Physically they were identical, but they had different traits that distinguished them one from another. So today I'd like to talk to you about the word Sabbath from two different Old Testament texts. They appear identical, but they're not. So as you know, the law is given in the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus, God gives the law to Moses, which includes the Ten Commandments, which includes the commandment that says that you should keep the Sabbath day holy, right? The book of Exodus. And then as Moses is toward the end of his life and is going to die, he gives the law a second time. We call that Deuteronomy. The Hebrew word Deuteronomy simply means the second giving of the law. So today we're going to look at the Sabbath from the perspective of the book of Exodus and the Sabbath from the perspective of the book of Deuteronomy and look at the distinctions and differences between the two. So we'll begin with the book of Exodus. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore, therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." All right, that's good. That's the rendering of Exodus. Let's look at the rendering of Deuteronomy. Similar but different. "Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. As the Lord your God commanded you, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. It shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your cattle or any sojourner who stays with you, so that your male servant and your female servant may be rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore," "the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." So again, at a casual reading of that, they might look the same, but they're not. So let's look at the distinction, shall we? There we go. All right, I hope this is large enough for you to see it. On the left-hand side, I'm going to talk about the creation motif, and that's the book of Exodus. On the right-hand side is the Egypt motif, and that's the book of Deuteronomy. All right, so we're going to look at the distinctions and differences between the two commands of the Sabbath day. Number one, the Exodus text is grounded in the creation. All right, so he takes us back to the Garden of Eden. Now, eventually, I'm going to ask you to go there. I'm going to really beg you to come to Eden. Eden is the place, you know Eden, don't you? Eden is the place where there was no sin. It was just absolute pure wonderment with God. It was perfection. The trees were perfect. The animals were perfect. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was awry. Everything was wonderful and as it should be by creative hand of God. And Adam and Eve walked with God in the cool of the day. I'm going to ask you to go there. I'm going to ask you this year, as we consider rest, to find yourself in a place of Eden during your Sabbath time. I want to talk to you about what Sabbath means, what it doesn't mean. But during your Sabbath time, your rest time, I'm going to ask you to go back to Eden. The Egypt motif on the right-hand side says Deuteronomy grounds Sabbath in the liberation. So now Moses takes you back not to Eden, but he takes you back to the Exodus. You remember the story, right? This is the greatest story in the whole Bible, man. Moses sees the burning bush. God speaks to Moses, and God says to Moses, "Go tell Pharaoh, let my people go." Whoa. One little guy going to Pharaoh, the king of all the land, and saying, "Let my people go." Who do you think you are? So, Moses is unsure of himself and says, "I don't know if I'm enough. I can't speak very well. Don't have any power." Then he says, "Well, there's your staff, throw it down." It becomes a snake. You know the whole story. It's a great story. Moses now takes them back to that time. Now the Sabbath here is grounded in your liberation. In this room today, as in any room given this size, there are different phases of your journey in liberation. When you first come to Christ as a brand new Christian, you are liberated and free from Egypt, from the old life, from the old world. And then progressively, God brings you progressively into liberation. When I first got saved, I quit cursing immediately. Done, just like that. Cursed like a sailor before I got saved. After I got saved, boom, it was all gone. I had no temptation to curse anymore. That's the craziest thing. Some sins take longer to be liberated from. So what I want to talk to you today about is in rest, you're going to find, as you learn to rest in Christ, really take a real rest, then you become more and more liberated from the things that might try to hook onto you. So if you can imagine, I can hold this cup easily enough because it has a handle. If it doesn't have a handle, it's a little more difficult to hold on to. Sometimes our lives are like the cup, right? It has handles to it. The enemy can easily grab us because we have not been liberated in that particular area yet, and before you know it, he has his hands all over us. All right? So, second point here in the creation motif. No, you go back. Did you change slides on me? No, go back. I'm not done with this first. Okay, there's a number of points on this slide. Number 2, Exodus remembers Eden. Deuteronomy remembers Egypt. I covered that. Exodus speaks of imitating divine example and receiving divine blessing. So, in other words, you are to imitate the rest that God took. God rested on the seventh day. Why? Not because he was tired. Is that right? God doesn't get tired. God doesn't need to sit down. God is always fresh. God's always full of vigor and energy and fullness. He's in fullness all the time. We run out of fullness, therefore we have to rest. So he calls us to imitate the divine example and then receive divine blessing. When you learn to do Sabbath well, when you learn to rest, there's always blessings involved with that. Your body will thank you. Your mind will thank you. Your spirit will thank you. Your children will thank you. Your wife will thank you. Your husband will thank you. And probably your coworkers will thank you. Because you've taken time to rest, to take Sabbath, and to replenish. I love the word replenish. And I think the first preaching day of the year, I talked to you about a lot of the words that start with R-E. Replenish, refire, re-this, re-that. There's something about replenishing, about what rest brings to the replenishment of your soul. I just said to somebody this morning, it's amazing what 4 days on a motorcycle can do to my mind. It's amazing. 4 days on a bike, an open road, and my mind just is so healed, so fresh. I can think so much better. There's something about rest that will enable you to think better, to be better, to act better. Deuteronomy speaks of taking hold of divine deliverance and observing divine command. Now, if you look at the Deuteronomy text, there's a command there, right? At the very end it says, he talks about God with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, delivering them right from the bondage of Egypt, pulls them right out of there, brings the 10 plagues upon the land of Egypt, and then he says this, he says, therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath. You know what that's like when you're trying to distinguish between a command and a suggestion? I think every time I come to a stop sign, I think about that. I think, is that a suggestion? Well, if you want to, you can. If you have enough time, you can. If you feel like it, you can. No, man, I tell you what. Let me tell you what makes me stop every time at a stop sign. What is it? A cop. If I see a cop sitting in the parking lot, all of a sudden now that stop sign becomes a command to me, no longer a suggestion to me, because there are repercussions for not doing it. Before I'm done today, I want to talk to you about consequences of not Sabbathing, consequences of not resting. Exodus looks up toward heaven and Eden, and Deuteronomy looks back toward Egypt. Exodus gives a theological rationale for rest. Theologically, God rested, and he's God. And therefore, he calls you, invites you to the same rest that he's experiencing. There's a theological thread that runs through the text of the book of Exodus when we talk about the motif of Eden. Deuteronomy gives historical justification for rest. All right? This is what happened historically. You remember 40 years ago, right? Anybody here 40 years ago? Oh, yeah. Joshua, you were here there 40. Anybody else? Yeah, 40 years ago. This is what happened 40 years ago. Historically, therefore, as a result of that, I'm calling you to take the Sabbath and rest. There's something about history, isn't there, that teaches us. The last thing on this slide is Exodus evokes God's character. One of the attributes of God, he's a God of rest. Deuteronomy evokes God's redemption. So I love the word redemption. That means if you are redeemed, you are paid for, you're bought with a price. So in the book of Deuteronomy, we are redeemed. God redeemed us symbolically through the Hebrew people, paid the price. What's the price? Right? The lamb, the blood of the lamb on the door lintels, the door frames. That was the price that was paid. Redemptively, God saved a people from their bondage. And redemptively today, God saved you from your bondage. And before you get out of here today, I'm going to challenge you to look into your own life and see if there are still bondages that are there. And sometimes it's the bondages that stop us from Sabbathing well. Personalities. By the way, I probably every time I'll stand here and preach this year to you, I'll be preaching to me first, and you just get the slosh over. Because quite honestly, rest is the word that I need to take hold of for my own personal life. If I look at my own personality, it is not given to rest. In fact, it is... it pushes back against the concept of rest. So just so you know, I've already worked this thing through here this week, grueling through it before I give it to you. So Deuteronomy evokes redemption. Next slide. Exodus calls us to holy mimicry, be like God because we are not. I'll get to that in a few minutes. Be like God, because by the way, you're not God. Just if you're in any question, you're not God. Deuteronomy calls us to holy defiance to ever be slaves again. If you've ever been freed from something, you are determined never to go back there again. If you've been freed from the bondages, you've been liberated by the Lord your God, you never want to go back there again. You never want to hear the prison doors clank again, spiritually speaking. You never want to go back to habitually living a particular way that you were before Christ redeemed you and pulled you out of that whole mess. So there's nothing back there for me. I'm only looking forward and going forward to what God has for me. I refuse to look backward. All right, I'm not going to go back to that old place. Exodus reminds us that we are God's children, his creation. I don't know if there's anything more that I love in my life personally as a believer in Jesus as this. To sitting on my Father's lap and say, Abba, Father. For me, that's the greatest privilege on the earth. There's nothing I could ever do upon the face of the earth that makes me feel better than that, sitting upon the lap of the Father and saying, Abba, Father, and knowing, listen to me carefully, knowing I have his approval, knowing I have his love, knowing I have his encouragement, knowing I have his full, total embrace. At the end of the day, man, I don't need approval from anybody. I don't seek it. I don't look for it. I don't need it. You know why? Because I have approval of the Father. And once you have approval from the Father, nothing else matters. I only have to please two people in the world. That's God and my wife. That's it. That lets me off the hook. It does. Should let you off the hook as well. That somewhere along the line we have to mimic God and live like he is so that we can be released to be in the full measure of who God's called you to be. I'm his child. The Deuteronomy flip side of that reminds us we're no one's slave. We're nobody's slave. I don't know who you think you are, trying to make me your slave. I'm not your slave. I'm nobody's slave. I'm the bondservant of Christ Jesus. The Apostle Paul calls himself that all the time. I love that word bondservant, by the way. A bondservant is one that's voluntarily given himself to the service of another. That's what I've done. 1973, I became a bondservant. I yielded my ear to the awl on the doorpost. I said, Jesus, I'm your servant forever. Paul, who wrote most of your New Testament, calls himself a bondservant over and over again. Why? Because he felt more comfortable with the Father's management of his life than his management of his life. And that's the place of discipleship. That is a good definition of discipleship. When you become better, feel better about where God's taking your life and where you can run it yourself. I'm almost done here on this aspect. So here we are. Now, Exodus is an invitation. Come and rest with me. Is anybody old enough to remember the Calgon commercials? Let Calgon take you away. Yeah, how cool is that? God wants to take you away. Exodus is an invitation. Deuteronomy is a warning. I command you. That's my best God voice. I command you to keep the Sabbath. My kids know my voice. Hey, Kate, what's up, girl? Versus, Catherine? She knows she's in trouble. Say, you get that. If you're a parent in the room, you know you've done that. You've done that. You've changed the intonation of your voice. You've deepened it somehow, so your child knows that you mean business. Here, in the Exodus motif, the Eden motif, the voice of the Father is, come rest with me. In Deuteronomy, it's, I'm commanding you. It's a stern word, son, daughter. I'm commanding you to Sabbath with me. If you don't, there'll be consequences. Do you understand me? That's my other thing. You look at them and do you understand me? And all my kids said, yes, I understand you. All right, last one here. Sabbath is a return to Eden, and in the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy, Sabbath is a refusal to go back to Egypt. Right? good. So that's the distinctions. Now, let's move on. If return to Eden is to imitate God, to remind us that we are not God, this is why we keep the Sabbath. I need to keep the Sabbath to know that I need to rest my body, or at some point it will rebel against me. My mind will rebel against me. My soul will rebel against me if I keep rushing every day. So I just talked to someone not long ago that said that they were working, this is their 14th straight day at work. And I thought, that is not healthy. Not healthy. So my urge for you this year, my invitation for you, as well as God's command to you, is to pull aside, find a Sabbath day where you do nothing except quiet before God. Learn to read again. Learn to be quiet again. Here's what I found is the enemy to our culture in terms of quietness is this thing right here. Have you noticed? This thing right here, actually, at some point, an invention, technology of any kind, not talking about phones, but I'm talking about any technology in the world, can become your master if you permit it to. So here's, in our household, when we have dinner together, the Snow family has dinner together. We're dwindling down. There's less of us all the time, but now whoever's around the table knows that nobody touches a phone, including Dad. During Dad Pastor. Nobody touches the phone during dinner time. Okay? When I'm out on a date with my wife, and we're on a date, not a working date, because we have working dates, right? We get that. Working dates, you bring your phone. Dates, I love you. No, we don't need your phone for that. Because she's right in front of you, man. She's hot right in front of you. You don't need a phone, she's just right there. So we need to learn that how to regulate that thing, so we know that we can't run 7 days without break, without time, downtime. All right? Refusal to go back to Egypt. Refuse to go back to Egypt. To refuse Sabbath is to spurn the gift of freedom. I just want to let that soak in for a minute. To refuse Sabbath is to spurn the gift of freedom. Don't romanticize your past bondage. Slaves don't rest. They have no freedom to rest. When I was a slave, I could not rest. I didn't have the right to rest. Everyone in the room has a testimony, and I appreciate that. We've all come from somewhere. We've all come from some place before God got a hold of us. Have you ever heard somebody share their testimony, and it's almost like they glory in all the bad things they did? Yeah, well, I robbed a bank and, shot 3 people, and now I know Jesus. And somehow the emphasis becomes on robbing and shooting and pillaging and something about not romanticizing the past. I oftentimes, when I give my testimony, I say, I used to be a scoundrel. Then Jesus found me. You don't need to know how much of a scoundrel I was. You don't need to know all the details of my scoundrelness. My daughter's one. I think Emily, when she was young, she said, "Hey, Dad, tell me what kind of bad stuff you did when you were young." There's that magical moment happens right then, right now. There's that moment that happens when you have to be very careful what you say. Because the moment you say, I did this, I skipped school. Now, hey, Dad, you skipped school. You turned out all right. No. So I had to make a decision what I was going to tell my children that I did and my scoundrelness. And here's what I told my daughter, Emily. My scoundrelness was this. When I was in 6th grade, I stole a combination lock from the store. And that was all she ever knew. So therefore, she couldn't justify her bad behavior because of me. I don't romanticize any of my 17 years on the earth without my Jesus. It was dark and it was sinful. What I do romanticize is the day I fell in love. The day I fell in love with Jesus, man, it all changed just like that. And I made a decision to put my hands to the plow and not go back and not even look back. Not like Lot's wife taking a quick glance back. Just a quick glance back. No, I don't want to glance back. I remember how bad it was. Don't want to go back there again. All right. Rest is a condition of liberty. It's hard to rest if you're not liberated. In fact, it's probably impossible to rest if you're not liberated in a true spiritual sense of rest. The tyranny of the urgent. You've heard that phrase before, the tyranny of the urgent. It's what has to happen, and it has to happen now. It has to happen now. Taskmasters that interrupt Sabbath rest. Taskmasters despise rest. They create a culture where rest is constantly stolen from you. So help me with some examples of the taskmasters that steal your rest when you're trying to Sabbath. What would those things be? No, that's not the answer I'm looking for at all. I've determined I'm going to rest, and this taskmaster comes. You know who the taskmasters were, right? In Pharaoh's Egypt, they were the men that were in charge of making sure the Hebrew slaves did their work so Pharaoh could kick back and eat his grapes. So they're taskmasters in your life that prevent you or try to interrupt your Sabbath, your rest time. What would those be? Kids. Who said kids? Okay. Now, I don't ever see kids as a taskmaster. I see kids as those delightful interruptions that are a blessing that God gave me, just so you know. And I mean that all seriously. So Pastor and I were watching a TV show last night, and 3 times, maybe 4, Katie came in and said, "Can you put that on pause?" Because she was, she was a girl, so she's showing us her fashion show, what she's going to wear to church today. So she had all these outfits she wanted us to look at and say yes or no, up or down, So I gladly hit the pause button. You know why? Because I get a chance to spend a couple minutes with my little girl. So yesterday, at the tyranny of the urgent, my battery is dead in my phone, so I had to go to Apple. I hate going to Apple. I don't mind going to Apple to look around, but I hate going to Apple because it's always a wait. So the day says 2 hours. 2 stinking hours. Because the place is full of people. 2 hours. Now there's 2 approaches to 2 hours. Oh man, I've got to kill 2 hours. I've got to kill 2 hours. Or, I took Katie with me, by the way. I got to spend 2 hours in the mall with my daughter. Hot dog. I hate malls. I do, seriously. That's not a joke. I hate malls. I hate them. I come just short, this much short of saying this, they're from the devil. I just hate those places. Because when I shop, I shop. If I'm wearing a brown pair of shoes, I walk in the door of Macy's, head for the shoe department. I don't look anywhere else. I'm not looking for it. I'm going to buy brown shoes. I walk there, I find my brown shoe, 9.5D, done, out. I got to buy a pair of shoes in about 8.5 minutes. Done. Plus time to park. But 8.5 minutes, I'm done. I hate malls. But yesterday, 2 hours with my little girl. And we talked about all kind of crazy stuff. 15-year-old girl stuff. Yeah, so that's good. I'm sitting here Sabbathing and quietly, and I'm thinking about Sylvia Corrigan. Sylvia's name pops in my mind, and I thought, you know what? I forgot to send her email back to her. So what happens? The taskmaster says, well, you better do that right now. Sylvia might be upset with you. We better get her email zipped off right now. I was supposed to meet with Khadijah last week. Snow stopped that whole thing. Now, Sabbathing, I'm resting before God, and the Lord says, Khadijah's waiting for your phone call. Better get that moving right now. Say those are the taskmasters in our lives that keep us moving and prevent us from Sabbathing, from being quiet. Yeah. Taskmasters are slave drivers, and they are masters of half-truth. Now, the half-truth might be, I'm sorry, Sylvia. I should have returned the phone call. That part's true. But the other part's not true. Sylvia's not going to be angry because I forgot an email. She's going to give me grace. Say that the taskmasters, they operate and they traffic in half-truths. So here we are now. Moses said to Pharaoh, let my people go so they may worship. That's resting in God. There's no true worship without rest. You're hard-pressed to be a worshiper if you don't understand rest. It's hard to worship on the go. You can do it. It can't be. I can drive and, zip, 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 and worship music, zip, 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 zip. Or I can quietly listen. Just let the worship. I begin to worship, and there's just something about that if I tried to do that while driving, I would have an accident because I'm just so caught up in the presence of my King. Yeah. Now, let me almost close with, there's a cost to not keeping Sabbath. Okay. Take you back to the Bible. It's a good place to go. I'm going to go back to 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and listen to these words. Then they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. This is 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar is coming in and doing all these bad things to the nation of Israel. And they burned all of its fortified buildings with fire and destroyed all its valuable articles. Those who had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon. And they were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation, it kept Sabbath until 70 years were complete. So here's the deal. Israel, the nation, neglected Sabbath 70 years in a row. They had sabbatical years. They neglected Sabbath 70 years in a row. And God says, remember back to Deuteronomy, this is I command you to Sabbath. Now, God was done. 2 Chronicles says that Israel became to the place where there was no remedy. They were sick to the place where there was no remedy. The only remedy for them was 70 years in captivity in Babylon into a foreign land. 70 years neglect of the Sabbath, 70 years in captivity in Babylon. It's always better to listen to God when he hasn't yet raised his voice. Have you noticed that? Yeah. Same thing with your kids. Yeah. Hey, Leah, would you go do that for me? 5 times she ignores me. Each time my voice raises. Right? At some point she knows, business, she better go do the thing. At some point, God is whispering to us, listen carefully. At some point, God is whispering to us to change, to adjust, to grow, to mature. Whatever the thing is God's calling you to do. And you can either obey at the whisper, or you can wait till their Babylonians are at the front door. Now, 2 Chronicles references Jeremiah. So let me take you to the Jeremiah text. All right, so it's Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 10 and 11. It says this. Moreover, I would take from them the voice of joy, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones and the light of the lamp. This whole land will become a desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. What do you give up when you don't Sabbath? What do we give up when we don't rest? Yeah, let me tell you what we give up. We give up joy and gladness. It's hard to have joy and gladness when you're running full steam 7 days a week. When you've not allowed time to rest and to let your body catch up. The scariest part of the verse is what you lack is the voice of the bridegroom. The bridegroom is Christ. You forsake that. You give that up. For what? Because we oftentimes equate busyness with productivity. That's simply not true. Just because we're busy does not mean we're producing anything. It just means we're busy. I don't ever want to give up the voice of the bridegroom, do you? Hey folks, I'll give you anything I've got. Don't take the voice of the bridegroom from me. Don't take the voice of my Jesus from me. It's what I live for every day. It's what keeps me going all my life, to hear the voice of my master. The last thing you give up there is the voice of the bride. This is the beauty which you're here. This is the bride. Let me tell you what happens when you get too busy to come to church. This is what you miss. You miss the voice of the bride. Oh my. The highlight of my week is Sunday morning, to spend time with the bride. I don't care how important work is. You can't let people drive you. You can't let taskmasters drive you 7 days a week and you forsake this. If you forsake this long enough, I text 3 people this morning, by the way, from the platform, letting them know that I missed them because they're not here, because they're neglecting this and they're missing the voice of the bride. Now, let me close by saying this. A final reminder what Sabbath is and what Sabbath is not. Sabbath is not sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday night. That's not Sabbath. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. Sabbath is a day that you choose. My Sabbath is Monday. Weird day, right? Monday's, yeah, that's because Pastor had Mondays off. That's my Sabbath day. The day of the week is irrelevant. In the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, there was worship. There was Sabbath from Friday night to Saturday night. I can switch over, David. Good. In the New Testament, then that changes from Saturday to Sunday. But it doesn't matter what day of the week you have Sabbath. What matters is you spend time quietly with God. You just pull out of the busyness of the world. Rest in Him and allow God to recreate you, replenish you, refire you. Worship, we come here on Sunday morning, the first day of the week. You know why? Because we begin our week begins on Sunday. Sunday is the first day of the week, not Monday. Monday is the first business day. Sunday is the first day of the week. We begin our week with worship. And then we work through, come back to worship again. All right, so I'm done. Tell me what you heard. Tell me anything that you heard today, that you picked up. Rest is a condition of liberty. That's excellent. Yes. Yeah. When you neglect the Sabbath, you risk losing joy. Anything else? That's good. Sabbath is not a suggestion, like the stop sign isn't. You don't neglect the voice of the bride. That's right. It's sweet. She has a sweet voice. A difference between being busy and being productive, yeah. Bonnie? Yeah, yes. Yes. Listen to the whispers of God, not His yelling. When I yell at my kids, okay, just Melissa, when I yell at my kids, it's not because I don't love them. I just don't want to be ignored. Same thing with the Father. Right, so it's both motifs together, right? The Sabbath reminds us of both motifs. The Father rested after creation, and then the fact that he delivered. Yeah, it's good. Okay, anything else? Interesting. It makes Pastor Sharon wonder how many other commands we're missing. That, my dear, is for another day. Maybe he'll preach that. All right, Father, thank you for today. Lord, we are just delighted to be in your presence. Delighted to be in the presence of your bride. But I pray that 4 things will be true of us. We would have the voice of joy. We would have the voice of gladness. We would hear the voice of the bridegroom. And we spend time with the voice of the bride. Lord, bless this day in Jesus' name. Amen.